you, Senator Steele-John. Senator Reynolds.
Thank you very much, Mr Acting Deputy President. I too rise to discuss the health of our democracy, but this case in relation to the enduring value of our liberal democratic allies globally. And I was reflecting on the Prime Minister's successful visit to the United States last month and the genuine warmth and mateship between Prime Minister Turnbull and President Trump. And for me, and I'm sure others, it was a very timely reminder of the enduring values that have and that continue to bind our two nations, and indeed continue to bind Australia with other liberal democratic allies. The strength and value of this particular relationship was reflected in the achievement a couple of weeks ago of an exemption for our steel and aluminium industries from tariffs in the United States, something not achieved by any other nation outside of NAFTA. Friends and shared values. It also is timely to reflect that democracy, even here in Australia, is not self-sustaining and can never be taken for granted. Australia is not immune from threats to our democracy, and one of them, as Senator Steele-John has just so eloquently described, is our democracy does rely on citizens' engagement and enfranchisement. And the sad fact is globally that democracy is on the decline. According to Freedom House's Global Freedom Index, 71 countries last year alone suffered net declines in political rights and liberties. This marked the 12th consecutive year of decline in global freedom and the lowest point for democracy in more than a decade. And it has caused me to reflect on the nature of our own democracy and what are the relationships and the institutions that we need to make sure we keep strong here in Australia. And it's very clear to me, and very clear, I think, to many in this place, that democracies must continue to deliver both economic prosperity and security. One cannot be achieved without the other, and both economic security and security itself are required for a stable democracy. So this means that we must maintain strong relationships with the nations who most closely share our values and with whom we have developed mutual trust and also genuine relationships. Statements last month by both the Prime Minister and President Trump on the enduring importance of global security, free trade and economic growth are reminiscent of the shared values and the relationships between Roosevelt, Churchill and Menzies at the height of World War II. These themes were also reinforced in last week's successful ASEAN-Australia Summit, which again reaffirmed the importance of the ASEAN-Australia Strategic Partnership. It was an explicit reaffirmation of a mutual commitment to rules-based order, sovereignty, economic growth, regional peace and security. And again reflecting back into the height of World War II in 1942, Robert Menzies commenced a weekly radio address with this observation: "One of the many troubles, I was going to say, of democracy, but perhaps I should say of ourselves as people in Australia, is that we do not think enough and we take too many astonishing things for granted." Then, as in 1942, Robert Menzies could have been referring to a great many issues we take for granted here in Australia. But in this particular address, he was referring to what Winston Churchill, the year before, in 1941, had called the most unsordid act in recorded history, the most unsordid act in human history. Now, this most astonishing and unsordid act was actually a little-known statute, an American statute, in fact, called the Lendlease Act. As I said, it was a very short statute, which was passed by the American Congress in March 1941 to promote the defence of the United States. The Act was integrated by President Roosevelt after a plea from the United States, from Winston Churchill to the United States, which, has to note, was a neutral nation at the time, to provide Great Britain with the tools to finish the war. And in 1941, Churchill had provided both the moral and the economic reasons for the United States' support. And this is some of what he said. He said, the moment approaches when we shall no longer be able to pay cash for shipping and other supplies. If, at the height of this struggle, Great Britain was to be divested of all saleable assets, so that after victory was won with our blood, civilisation saved, and the time gained for the United States to be fully armed against all eventualities, we should stand stripped to the bone. Such a course would not be in the moral or the economic interests of either of our two countries. This plea resonated with President Roosevelt, again, president of a nation still neutral, but he came to believe it was in the United States' interests to support the war effort to defeat the Nazis, without once again saddling Allied nations with crippling and politically destabilising post-war debts. Quite astonishingly, this Act conferred upon the President wide-ranging powers to authorise the selling, the exchanging, the leasing and the lending of any such defence article for the government of any country whose defence the President deems vital to the defence of the United States. It also provided the President with post-war powers to determine the terms and conditions upon which payment or repayment was to be made, if they were to be made at all. And that is, in the words of Churchill, astonishing and one of the most unsorted acts ever. The Parliament of a neutral nation giving their President wide-ranging powers to provide billions of dollars of material support to other nations with the power to have it repaid or not. As astonishing as this unsorted act was to both Churchill and Menzies, the motives which effectively ended a decade of United States neutrality were complex, they were pragmatic, and ultimately they were far-sighted and still resonate with nations around the world today. So President Roosevelt knew that Great Britain was running out of money to fund its war effort, and then when that happened, the US would have to enter the war to finish it themselves and pick up the tab for post-war reconstruction. The following year, in his Lendlease speech as part of the Forgotten People series, Robert Menzies was also clearly considering the post-World War. He said this: "A world war makes us a world nation, not a parochial community, but a world community. Nothing so contributes to peace amongst men as the maintenance of ordinary, decent commercial relations, and these relations can only be restored by the most liberal statesmanship when the war is over." Now, what Menzies, Churchill and Roosevelt clearly understood then, in the height of World War II, was that both economic prosperity and security were required for democratic stability. Australia's future has always been, I believe, and still remains, a shared one with our liberal democratic allies. And I think in the changing global geostrategic environment, this is something incredibly important for all of us to remember here in this chamber. A future in which both our economic and our security requirements remains inextricably linked with our liberal democratic allies. And as I said, to endure, our democracy here in Australia has to keep delivering economic prosperity and security for all Australians. History, I'm sure, will record our Liberal Democratic alliances to be an astonishing and a far-sighted commitment to the present and to our shared democratic futures. The very astonishing thing that Robert Menzies in 1942 warned all Australians never to take for granted. Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy President.